You're watching The Business of Law. I'm Pacchia. BigLaw is getting the Businessweek cover treatment this week. Joining me now is the article's author, Paul Barrett, assistant managing editor and senior writer at Bloomberg Businessweek. Welcome back to the program. Thanks for joining us.
You bet. Glad to be here.
So BigLaw is not a happy place these days, and it's a topic we cover weekly on this program, talking to both lawyers and consultants. I'm curious to hear from you as someone who covers stories in the business world. What do you think are the major economic challenges facing BigLaw at this moment?
Well, I think this segment of the legal industry, which after all is not the whole legal industry. We're talking about the 15% of lawyers in this country who work for the 250 biggest law firms, are buffeted by a number of forces. One is still the echoes of the recession. I mean, they, like a lot of other businesses, suffered tremendously during that period. It just so happens that running up to the most recent recession, there really was a bubble in big law the way there was in housing and on Wall Street and certain other parts of the economy. There were too many lawyers being produced. Law firms were in too many cases getting too big, merging without enough economic justification. And now we're seeing the fallout, the restructuring, the reckoning from some of that overkill.
Let's talk about that reckoning for a moment and how it's going to affect big law firms. Is this something that's going to play out over a long period of time, giving firms some space in which they can adjust, or is this going to be a hard crash landing?
Well, I think we're in the midst of a very difficult crash landing that's taking place now and will persist for at least another several years. I think smart people realize that we have not seen the last of the major law firms that are going to collapse completely. I think that there are still firms that have overextended themselves to such a degree, we may not be aware of which one it is at this point, that you're going to see another big firm or two in coming years collapse, a la Dewey and LaBeouf, or the firm that I happen to focus on in my article, the Howery firm from Washington. These are firms that have countless very talented, very busy lawyers, and yet there are too many of them under one roof. Their structure in terms of the number of offices, the number of guarantees that have been made to big shot partners are just out of whack with their billable hours, and eventually, someone has to pay the piper.
Yeah, I think there are a few things in law messier than a law firm going into bankruptcy. It's not a fun process for anyone involved. I want to bring up this fascinating chart you had in your article. You have the underemployment statistics, the percentage of graduates who don't get legal jobs, laid against the projected cost of a legal education for the 2016 class at the cheapest and most expensive law schools, respectively. So we have Columbia, which has a high cost but excellent odds of getting a legal job. But some of the other high-cost schools, notably 5 other New York law schools, 30% or more of the graduates aren't getting legal jobs. If you were thinking to go to law school today, has the number of schools that one would even begin to consider just shrunk to a handful?
Yeah, I think a handful might be an overstatement, but on the other hand, I think people thinking about law school need to be much more cautious and much more strategic and much more realistic about where a law degree might take them at the moment. I think the worst part of the lawyer bubble has affected the beginning of the pipeline, the education and the law school end. It is just empirically the fact that in this country we have for a number of years been producing too many people with JDs, and it appears that we're set to do that for another 7-8 years.
Right.
And a lot of younger people are going to suffer. There just are not legally oriented jobs out there for them.
Yeah, the numbers are just ridiculous, and your cover alludes to the estimate that American law schools are going to produce something like 176,000 JDs this decade, more than there are legal jobs created. This is an enormous imbalance between the number of law school grads and jobs created. How much are law schools to blame for this current situation?
I think they are to blame in part. Law schools have acted like businesses. They have responded to the stimuli of relatively liberal federal student loan availability, and they have expanded their classes, and they have advertised their services, namely the production of a credential that will get you a job in a fairly predictable and direct way, with a fair amount of puffery. They've implied that you come to our school, serve your 3 years, pay your $150,000 in tuition, and God knows how much more to live and eat and so forth. And there's a career waiting for you, when it has been increasingly clear for several years now that that's no longer true for a very substantial number of people. Not just the three duds in the class, but probably for the whole bottom half of the class is going to have to struggle to get a job, unless you're talking about the top 10 or 15 law schools, which will continue, I think, to have a lot of success placing many of their students.
Right, but for any law school, as you point out, they're economic animals, and it's hard to use another metaphor, put that truck in reverse. I mean, lowering class sizes has ramifications that are not all that positive for people running law schools.
Right. Well, I think as we've seen consolidation in big law, the practice of big law, we're going to see consolidation in law schools. I mean, there have been some prestigious schools that have already announced that they're going to begin to reduce their class size. I mean, I think Northwestern is one of those. And I think you're going to see some schools that are not in the upper tier in terms of prestige and their tradition and their ability historically to place people in well-paying jobs. I think some of those schools are going to be in danger of continuing to exist. I think a big question is going to be raised as to whether they'll be able to sustain themselves.
Ugly stuff. I didn't see any mention of a lot of alternatives for law schools in your article. Is this just a dire situation that cannot be turned around, or is there a way to bring back the golden days for big law?
I don't think that there's any particular reason why, as a society, we should want to bring back the golden days. I think the golden days had a lot of flim-flam built into them. These $1 million partner takes are not something that every graduate of a decent law school can just expect, from day one after graduation on out to retirement. I think all of that was overblown and a function to some degree of greed and hubris. And I think the consolidation of all of this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing for clients if law firms have to compete more vigorously and provide services at more reasonable rates, or at least raise their rates at a more reasonable level. And if people have to consider other lines of work, that's not the end of the world. There's no constitutional right to being a corporate lawyer.
All right, Paul, really interesting article. Thank you so much for stopping by.
My pleasure.
That's Bloomberg Businessweek's Paul Barrett. If you'd like to learn more about the issues we just discussed, go check out our offerings on the Bloomberg Terminal and BloombergLaw.com, and also Businessweek.com. You can see more of our videos on YouTube, and you can follow our updates on Twitter. I'm Pacchia. Thanks for watching.